Okay, so we have quite a number, few people already on the call, on the webinar now. So I'm just gonna go ahead and get started. I'm gonna start off first by introducing myself. For folks who don't know me, my name is Taneeka Richardson, and I am the Housing Policy Analyst with the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. If you're not already familiar with MDCEP, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy research in a research organization kind of focused broadly on advancing economic justice. Our, our organization was founded in the belief that all Marylanders should be able to achieve their full potential in a healthy economy that offers a widely shared and rising standard of living. So before we get started, I just want to go over some housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be shared with all of you afterward. We'll take questions, any concerns at the end of the webinar, and you can use the Q&A feature located on the bottom of your screen, okay? Having a safe place to live and rest each night is essential for all Marylanders, but particularly for children. Today, our expert panel will discuss the challenges faced by families in underserved communities, the role of equitable housing policies in promoting educational success, and strategies for fostering stronger, more resilient neighborhoods. So with that said, I'm super excited to announce our panelists that we have for you today, okay? First, we have Edward Blackstone. He is the Youth Collaboration Coordinator for Homeless Persons Representation Project. We have Katherine Davis, the Director of Courtroom Advocacy Project for Pro Bono Resource Center of Maryland, and Lisa Sarro, our General Counsel for Arundel Community Development Services. Before we get started, I would like to, invite each of our panelists to share a bit more about their background and how they came to this work. Edward.
How you doing, everybody? As Taneeka most wonderfully said, I'm Edward Blackstone. I'm the Youth Collaboration Coordinator at an organization called Homeless Persons Representation Project, where I work to assist homeless youth between the ages of 18 and 24 who are going through living instability. And I also work with an amazing group of young people called the Baltimore City Youth Action Board. They're a youth-led advocacy board, age range of 16 to 24, and their main goal is just to advocate on behalf of homeless youth while also bringing those resources to the community. And I'm also the vice chair of the Baltimore City Continuum of Care, which is an amalgamation of homeless service providers within Baltimore City, government officials, and individuals with lived experience who get around $30 million per year to provide direct services to the homeless community. And it is wonderful to be here. Also, for the past 7 years before I actually got into this position, I was a Baltimore City educator where I taught elementary, middle, high school, children with special needs, and I also taught at an accelerated one-year program for individuals that were around 2 to 3 years behind in credits, with the hope that if they had 6th or 7th grade credits, we would accelerate them 1 year to get them into high school. So that's all about me. It's wonderful to be here.
Nice, thank you, Edward. That's going to be a hard act to follow. You see, you wear many hats. Thank you for the work that you do. Katherine?
Sure, I'll try to follow that act, but I probably can't. So Katie Davis, as Taneeka said, I run the Courtroom Advocacy Project within PBRC. Thank you for having me here today. This is great. So what we do at the CAP, as we call it, we provide free attorneys for tenants facing eviction in Baltimore City and Baltimore County. So we also represent consumers who are faced with consumer debt, provide free attorneys for them as well. I'm also involved in legislative and systemic advocacy around tenants' rights and right to housing, and access to justice in general for low-income tenants and consumers. So, and I've been working along with other providers throughout the state to expand access to counsel in evictions, which is a state law that gives tenants facing eviction a right to counsel in their eviction action. So I'll stop there. I also have a background, a little bit in education. I'll get into that in a few minutes. But thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you for being here. Lisa?
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Lisa Sarro. I'm General Counsel at Arundel Community Development Services. And what ACDS is we are Anne Arundel County's nonprofit housing and community development agency. And so in that context, what we do is pretty much everything having to do with housing policy, including assisting with the development of affordable housing in our county, all the way down to direct services, providing eviction prevention funding. We have an eviction prevention program that was the first to be stood up in the state in response to the COVID crisis. And I believe that now following the COVID crisis, we are probably one of the only counties, if not the only county, that still has an eviction prevention program going. What we do also is we have an incredible team. Edward mentioned the continuum of care. We have an incredible team here at ACDS that works with our local continuum of care agencies, ensuring that county and state funds get out to all of those service providers that are helping people in the homeless community and prevention of homeless communities. Or agencies. And so we kind of see it all here, including what goes on with our folks in the schools trying to keep their students and their student families housed. So I'll stop there, but it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for introducing yourselves. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So I would like to start off by grounding us in what this experience is like for a lot of kids and youth and families today. Edward, for the youth that you are working with, how does having an unstable housing situation or becoming homeless affect other aspects of their lives, including school?
So I just want to start with school. So for example, if you don't have a stable place to live, you don't have access to a shower. You don't have access to a washing machine. So how are you going to be able to show up in the proper form to be able to be educated? Because as we know, sometimes being in school can be very cruel and a lot of things can be very forward stated. And so they won't show up to school. So a lot of times they fall behind academically. Let's just say even if they are able to have a job, let's just say they have a job, then they face housing instability, then they're no longer able to show up at work in a clean form. So it's just like then they fall behind when it comes to work. So another thing is, and a lot of times we don't think about this, so mental health is actually really big, especially now. And so a lot of times these students that are going through housing instability, they tend to isolate themselves out of fear of rejection, out of fear of being made fun of. And that causes them to essentially just go into their own shell where a lot of times they don't let anybody in. So a lot of times it's hard, even if they do show up at school, for teachers, for social workers to be able to get through to them. And then if we also think about a lot of times their future, a lot of times when young people go through, especially housing instability, it puts them in a thing called survival mode, because a lot of times when they're not in school, they tend to be essentially trying to find a way to survive. And a lot of times trying to find that way to survive means that they're putting themselves in a lot of uncomfortable situations. And then when you go into survival mode, you're just thinking about your most basic needs to survive. And over time, if you become accustomed to only wanting to get your basic needs to survive, you don't really think about what it would take to accelerate and get to the next level. So a lot of times, if you don't show up at school, you're not thinking about how to get to a high school diploma, which means if you're not thinking about how to get to a high school diploma, you're not thinking about how to get to a college degree. Even if you find a job, you're thinking about, I just need an entry-level job. I want to be a cashier. I want to work at a warehouse. You're not thinking about how can I become a manager. So a lot of times it also it makes them downplay their ability to elevate and survive and to thrive. And so these are some of the aspects. I don't want to get, I want to save it for a little bit later, but those are some of the aspects, especially as it affects youth in multiple different areas of their lives.
Yeah, wow, thank you. You hit a lot of good points, and I can't wait to hear you kind of delve in that a little bit later. Okay, so for Katie, when we talk about families not having stable housing, what does that mean? And more importantly, what kind of challenges and barriers are families facing in Maryland experiencing, the lead to kind of precocious housing situations?
Yeah, so stable housing. I think when you think of stable housing, I think of having a safe and reliable place to call home. So much of what Edward said is so true, and it's true in education and in housing. So I think safe is free from dangerous conditions, right? A house that's doesn't have mice all over it, lead, water, sewage leaks, inadequate security, lack of heat or power, right? It's a safe place. Reliable means it's affordable, and the family knows it's going to stay affordable. It means that the rent will stay constant, that the charges on their ledger are going to be reliable, fair, and consistent. It means the lease will be renewed unless there's a real reason not to be. Repairs will be made when they're needed. And also that there's safety nets in place if some of those things happen, that we all know things happen, whether you're in the hospital unexpectedly, lose a job, have some sort of injury, something like that, something that makes a family miss a little bit of rent for a short time being, right? Like safety nets in place to help with that. And I think some of the challenges that the families that we work with face are that are kind of a function of inadequate laws, inadequate affordable housing, and inadequate supports for these temporary setbacks. So some of the safety and reliability that I just talked about is provided for in Maryland law, but a lot of it's not. That's one of the things that we work to fix. Tenants do have rights, and they need to know about those. And tenants, they inherently struggle with an imbalance of power whenever they're dealing with a landlord or a management company. We see this in court all the time, but of course it happens outside of court too. That's part of what we do in my work, is we work to fill in those gaps, whether it's with legislation to make it easier for a tenant to force the landlord's hand in making repairs, or get more predictability around evictions, when they're going to happen, how they're going to happen, whether they happen, or rates of rent. But we also provide counsel, as I said, so that it kind of evens that playing field and try to lessen that power dynamic a little bit. And, you know, specifically for those challenges, I think the biggest one is really lack of affordable housing. You know, the less affordable housing out there is, the less choice tenants have. And this really impacts families with students in school. I didn't mention before, but in my previous job before this, I was working in schools through a truancy prevention program. And so as an attorney there, I worked to help students and families with the issues that were causing truancy. Number one was in unstable housing, right? And so when we work with families now who are having trouble finding affordable housing, a big challenge they often have is that they don't want to move in a way that's going to disrupt their children's schooling, whether it's to a different bus line or out of the jurisdiction or that type thing. So when tenants are paying too much in rent, they have hard choices to make, right? They're going to be deciding between rent and food. And if they have children at home, they're more likely to choose food than rent. So 76% of low-income renters are cost burdens, which means they spend over 50% of their income on rent, which is a big problem. And tenants who've been brought to court have a hard time finding housing because they didn't have that on their record. And we see that too with landlords who bring tenants to court a lot. I'll probably get into that later. But and finally, I mentioned briefly, I think a big challenge is this lack of adequate temporary rental assistance. I'm sure Lisa's going to talk about that more, but we see a lot of families who are just recovering from pandemic losses. They come to us and they can pay the rent now, but they missed a couple months a year ago. And because of the way the landlord is applying the rent that they're paying now, they're paying late fees and court costs every month, and they can never get caught up. That's a big challenge for families. And they're taking time off work. They're taking their kids out of school. They're doing all this stuff to come to court every week. So you can kind of see the circular nature. I could go on and on, like I'm sure everyone else could, about the challenge that we see, but they do all feed in. And I do think that when you're talking about families with children, it's amplified in so many ways. The choices are just that much more difficult and complicated.
And thanks so much, Katie. And you hit on a lot of points that you got, is dear to my heart. I heard a little bit of, you didn't go too much, but I heard a little bit of rent stabilization in there. I heard a little bit of some of bills be passed this session that's going to protect families from repeated violence and of eviction starting October 1st. And I'll let you guys get into that a little bit later in a second. But yeah, thank you. And that's a perfect segue. To go right into Lisa and kind of your work and what you've been working on. And Katie touched on this a little bit, but I'm gonna let you expand on it. What is I should say, like one of the main solutions that's getting a lot of attention right now has been the fact that Maryland, we have been able to pass a state program for funding for eviction prevention, right? Which has been really successful as we all know during COVID times is keeping families housed. Lisa, can you share just a little bit more about the benefits of this approach and what the current need is for eviction prevention statewide?
Right, sure. So during the COVID pandemic, money was flowing into the state, hundreds of millions of dollars, and that money was distributed through the counties, local jurisdictions to keep people who were out of work either due to health reasons or because their businesses were shut down, to stay housed. Thousands and thousands and thousands of families. Their housing was stabilized through that really, really difficult time. Unfortunately, that funding dried up toward the end of 2022, 2023. Very, very few counties, if any, have any of that funding left to use for eviction prevention. And what we know from a study that Taneeka MDCEP was part of, and a number of organizations that got together to form an alliance to try and support the extension of eviction prevention funds. A study was performed. What we learned is that more than 50%, it's closer to 60% of Marylanders are unable to handle a $1,000 emergency. That puts them at risk of eviction. And in Maryland, even with the new legislation that will increase the filing fee a bit, it's a very quick process. It's a fairly easy process to evict families, individuals and families. So we saw a whole bunch of evictions last year in 2023. We are seeing them in 2024 seem to level off a bit and a little bit lower than in 2023. But 2024, the good news is it's leveling off, and it's not quite as bad as it was in 2023 when we were having that whiplash from having all the money and then not having any money. But we are still looking at close to 60 evictions a day in Maryland. And what that means is not just people losing the roof over their head. There is no period for individuals and families to reclaim their property. So they don't just lose the roof over their heads, they lose everything. Everything is tossed out, considered abandoned. And that includes notebooks, school books, and notebooks, I mean computer notebooks, what the kids have in the house, toys, education, and imagine education-related materials. Imagine what that does to a child. Studies show that children do not, it's not just a delay in getting over this trauma. They do not get over the trauma of an eviction.
Thank you, Lisa, for bringing that up. You touched on a lot of good points. And before we move on, I want to ask you just one more question. So we know that creating and funding a program is just the first step, right? In this massive housing crisis that we're having here. The question that I have for you is, could each of you, really not just for Lisa, but for each of you, could you share one actionable step that you think policymakers, educators, or community members can take today to better align housing stability with educational success? And either one of you can go, no particular order. Who wants to take it?
So I can jump in on that, because I think I was up next to kind of talk a bit about the eviction prevention program that was passed in the last legislative session. So it wasn't everything that advocates would like to have in terms of eviction prevention funding, but it is a really great start. And it is a program whereby the Department of Housing and Community Development and the Maryland State Department of Education are working together to have a dedicated eviction prevention funding source for families who are with children in community schools. And those are community schools are those that are most challenged throughout the state. And so that program will shortcut some of the craziness, the scattered efforts to pull money together for families with children in school to keep them housed. And we've been really fortunate that the Department of Housing and Community Development stepped in to take that program. They are working closely with advocates and people on the ground doing this work to make sure that they're going to be able to make the most of that funding. It's not a whole bunch of money, but it was money that was hard fought for and will be well used. And hopefully that program, this is my policy goal, is hopefully that program will expand beyond just community schools as we move forward and we see what will undoubtedly be the success of that program.
And thank you, Lisa, for expanding on that.
Sure.
So I guess to piggyback off of that, because you're right, you were just to elaborate a little bit more, like, you know, just to kind of piggyback off of your last statement. What do you think? Like, well, how would you like to see or envision this to grow? Like, just what, more funding for the program in future years? Like, you know, how does this work continuing on?
Yeah, I think particularly in conjunction with the blueprint for Maryland, right? We've made a policy decision in our state that education is really important. Our new governor is really focused on children and families. I think that ensuring there is a, you know, kind of a fast track to remove the bureaucracy and the high level barriers to getting funding in an emergency situation. I think expanding that to all students, all student households would be huge. It would be huge and would have a lifelong impact on the kids that are at risk of eviction. For those evictions that it does prevent, lifelong impact and improvement on their outcomes in forever, literally forever.
Yeah, that's a good point. I know we're talking about the study. That's something that we, you know, that's something that came up a lot when we was doing this research, was the barriers and the red tape that it took for families to even be able to apply for the assistance to get, especially during the pandemic, right, when jobs and things were shut down. So this kind of flows right to Edward. Like, Edward, you know, can you just share just from your experience, like, what would it be like for, you know, a homeless youth or someone who doesn't have stable housing? You know, I would just imagine that maybe they don't even have these documents and things to even go into apply, you know, for the assistance. So can you just share a little bit like what that would be like for maybe a youth between the ages, you know, of like 15 to 18 or whatever they like, trying to navigate help? Or
so for me, I can actually speak off of my personal experience for this one. So I actually became homeless in the middle of my sophomore year of high school when I was 15 years old, and I was homeless all the way until I graduated. So I've slept on the street. I've done a lot of unsavory things. As I was talking about survival mode, I was speaking of myself as well. I would say that one of the most difficult things to navigate is the relationship between a child and a parent, because unfortunately, especially in this country, children are almost looked at as property of the parent instead of their own individuals. And so specifically in my case, I tried to go to shelters. It didn't work because I was an unaccompanied minor. I tried to go to my my guidance counselor in school, but a lot of times in schools, so I went to Dunbar High School. A lot of times in schools, this is something that we don't acknowledge, but children are viewed only as good as their grades. And so since a lot of times my grades were not as good, I didn't get a lot of the help that I needed. If I did receive a lot of services from schools, a lot of times they wouldn't navigate me through a lot of what it would take in order for me to get access to services, or I needed verification from my parent that I was going through the situation. And a lot of times, especially when it comes to some parents, they don't want to make it seem like they're not able to take care of their kids, which is a direct barrier towards me getting access to a lot of things that you said, Taneeka. So for example, how am I going to get access to my ID if I don't have a place to live and my parent doesn't verify that I'm homeless? How do I get access to a lot of the materials within schools? How can I even get access to going on a field trip if my parent can't sign the form? How can I get access to being able to get, because I know the Baltimore City Office of Student Specialized Services, they actually do offer to be able to give students bus tokens. They offer to give students clothes, but how do I get access to those services if my parent won't verify that I'm homeless? And so a lot of times when we're talking about a lot of these different things, how do I get a job? Because a lot of times if you're an unaccompanied minor, I wasn't able to do youth works because my parent wasn't willing to sign the form. So these are all direct obstacles for me being able to elevate. And on top of that, as I was speaking earlier about some of the ways that it affects students even outside of school, this creates a tumultuous relationship between them and the parent, which will ultimately provide them with a direct obstacle, a direct unwilling to move obstacle until they're 18 years old. I was unfortunately had to sleep on the streets because I did not have access to these things because I felt like I was viewed as property. So one thing that I would definitely say is that I challenge a lot of people here, especially since there are youth groups that are out here that are doing work, that are youth-led, who are no longer under a lot of those boundaries and those obstacles, like the Youth Action Board, like Baltimore Algebra Project, who have young people that are there that are able to speak on these issues. Try to understand and create spaces for young people to be able to come in and give their viewpoint. Even as it relates to policy, a direct barrier to youth understanding how that affects them is not having the information, not knowing where to go, not being able to speak up on these issues. Even right now, if we talk about affordable housing to a 30, 40, 50-year-old means a house. Affordable housing to a 15, 16-year-old is I just need a place to lay my head. Affordable housing to an 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old is I just need my first apartment, which opens them up to another obstacle, which Katie had actually spoke about, which is them not being understanding to the relationship between them and a landlord, them not understanding how to read leases, them not understanding credit and debit, which is also not taught in schools or taught to them by their parents a lot of the time. So I hope I gave like a little bit of insight, but these are some of the things on the ground that are actively going on. And so I just challenge everybody to challenge what your thought processes are as far as youth's ability to understand their situation, because their parents can't or won't always speak for them. So it's better if we're going to be proactive to have those conversations right now. So for example, in Baltimore City, there's no shelter for unaccompanied minors, which means there's 4,000 right now in Baltimore City Public Schools, there's 4,400 students that are identified as homeless. Those 4,400 students have absolutely nowhere to go and place themselves at the risk of being taken advantage of being in a lot of those tumultuous situations, of getting in contact with the juvenile justice system, because a lot of times if you're thinking about basic needs, they may just do something to get to end up there because they're just trying to survive. So these are some of the things I would like to speak about. We have to reframe our thought process behind youth not understanding their situations and needing someone to speak for them.
Wow. You said a lot. I mean, I don't even know how to follow up on that again. Like, that's why I reached out to you and I wanted you to be, on this panel, because it's important, like you said, to have, to invite you guys to be at the table, right? And just versus having people make decisions for you and we're not on the front lines and don't really understand kind of with, the whole situation as a whole. But kind of just following behind you, Katie, just hearing everything that Eddie just said, and you kind of, working in the schools, like, and you've been worked in the courtroom, like, what do you kind of see as a short-term or long-term solution, or how we can get more policymakers involved, or basically trying to address some of those barriers that Edward just mentioned?
Yeah, I agree. That was a lot, and I could not agree more with everything that Edward said. I will say in my time working in the Baltimore City schools with children who were and students who were dealing with truancy issues, the hardest group to work with was exactly what you were talking about. There was that 15 to 18 because of exactly what you were talking about. We worked with a lot of students who had those exact issues, and there was not much that we could do because the supports just aren't there. One of the big things that we did in that job, and I do in my current job too, is educate people about their rights. I mean, students have rights. You have a right to an education that suits you as a student. Renters have a right to housing. It's not codified, but I'm a firm believer that it actually is there is a human right to housing. They do have a codified right to counsel. We know that now in Maryland. But there is a federal act, the McKinney-Vento Act, that does provide some students rights to access their education if they are unstably housed. And so I think one thing that's important is for families and students and educators and anyone involved with students at all to understand that act and understand what the obligations are under that. Unfortunately, I think exactly what Edward is saying is the problem is that if you don't identify as homeless, or if you don't have a parent who's going to identify as homeless, it's really hard to access some of the rights that come through that act. So that's a big void that I'm glad there are a lot of groups out there really working to remedy. But I do think nonetheless, the federal law is there, and schools do have an affirmative obligation to identify students who are experiencing homelessness and provide them services such as transportation to schools and uniforms and fees for field trips, things like that. So I think there's a lot to be said for just making sure that students of any age, from 5 on up, understand that they have a right to an education, and not just any education that suits them. That includes supports if they need special education supports, all sorts of supports, regardless of their academic progress, right? Students are required, I mean, schools are required to provide that, even for those students that don't boost their test scores and don't help them in that way. And tenants also, now they have a right to counsel, they have a right to live someplace that is safe and secure. So I think in my current job, we do a lot of outreach and just educating tenants about coming to court when they get these notices, things like that. It's hard if you're a parent with students. It's hard to, in a job, to get to court, but you do have a right to ask for a continuance or a right to ask for a postponement, things like that. I think that's where I would say is just to get the word out to people, to push back a little bit, right? To stand up and use this counsel that is free to you. That's what we're here for, to advocate alongside you, and that sort of thing. I think I covered it. I'll stop there.
Yes, thanks, Katie. And that's really important too. What I've been finding is that I think for like a year or 2 years now, we did pass the access to counsel bill. And I think a lot of that too is just education, because a lot of folks, just still don't know that they have this resource available to them because we've gone so many years without it. So it's still kind of new. I think that bill is or that funding and stuff, it's only maybe like 2 years old. So
Right.
that's another webinar for another topic, but
And I'll just add also, I think another thing that's important for people to know is that landlords can't evict without a judicial action, right? There's no self-help evictions in Maryland. And so we get a lot of calls from families who say someone showed up and evicted them, but they can't do that, and there is a remedy out there for that unless they've gone to court first.
Thank you. And so real quick, Felicia, if you could just take a couple of minutes, because you touched on this earlier. And I think everyone else in the call is going to ask this question, like, what was Anne Arundel County doing, that you guys seem like the model, right? You started earlier that you guys were able to still continue to run, even before we had this, because like you said, the statewide program, like we have the funding, right? That's going to be started, I think, October, but it's still going to be limited, right? And your county program, I think, is still available for everyone. So can you just take a couple minutes and just kind of share, like, what were your lessons learned and maybe some things that other counties or other places could kind of replicate?
Sure. So one of the first things that we did in Anne Arundel County, once we figured out this is going to last, we are going to be in this mess for a long time, was our county executive, our county hopped right in with both feet and provided county funds to get the program started before state or federal funds started to flow into the county. And that's really kind of bookended by where we are now. We're still using, just the last trickles of those federal dollars. And then, there's a priority on keeping people housed, and that's reflected in funding that's made available to keep our program going. But I think several things really came together to make our program so successful. And among those are collaborations, community partnerships. We immediately brought on a legal services provider from the very beginning, even when the moratorium was in place. And so that provider has expanded. We work with Community Legal Services. They've grown their program thanks in large part to the Access to Counsel and Evictions program in our county. And they were really entrenched in our eviction prevention funding program, and we had easy access to them to make referrals for eviction prevention services. But in addition to that, we threw ourselves into the community, I call them the helpers. We have a really robust benevolence coalition of nonprofits, faith-based organizations, and they meet monthly to just figure out, how can we help? What can we do? What are we seeing? What are the trends we're seeing? And the same with our continuum of care agencies. Everyone really, really pulled together and speed dial. If we can't do it, who can? Who can help? How do we get this person legal assistance? How do we get them food assistance? How do we get them what they need to keep going? And our McKinney-Vento liaison is part of those meetings. I think that's been crucial also, so that they are kept apprised of eviction law, so that they know exactly what Katie's been talking about, that there are rights, and that they also can help the students who are having difficulty getting into school if they've moved locations, so that they can keep a roof over their heads. They don't necessarily need to change schools, and they can get that transportation so that they can maintain their educational stability, even when their housing stability is not so solid. So I think that the shorter answer to your question is collaboration, cooperation, and a lot of heart from all of our community organizations, and then our team internally that really rose to the occasion.
Thanks. And that's actually going to segue right to the last question before we take questions from the audience. So if you guys have not already, please make sure you are putting your questions in the chat. You just said it's almost like Florida, right? Collaboration, right? Which is literally my last question for the panelists is, can you kind of share, like, what do you see the role of government, government advocates, education advocates, community organizations? What do you see as the strength of bringing everyone's together, right, to talk about housing and education? Because one thing I found about doing this work, and I joke about this a lot, is that when I go to housing housing meetings or housing lobbying meetings, it's all the same people, right? And it's like no one's talking to each other, right? So it's like, I'm finding even within my own work, having a little struggle of bringing, hospitals or people who work in maybe, working with, well, now I have youth people, so I have Edward, but, people are just like, working with, newly released, inmates, like trying to bring everybody together, because for me, like housing, as we're seeing, is really the root of everything, right? So we definitely, as we can see in an example of Anne Arundel County, that you guys feel like you guys have been successful because it was a cross-sectional, collaboration and approach. So my question for the panelists, as we're getting questions, is, what do you see the role is, and how can you guys think we can bring more people or who typically would not be involved in housing work, because we need them?
I mean, I would definitely like to kick this one off. I mean, it's nothing better than to hear from the horse's mouth, right? There's a lot of positions that are created off of the backs of individuals who are going through housing instability, but those same jobs that are created, first of all, are usually not filled by people who have experienced housing instability, nor a lot of the times are they interacting on a consistent basis with people with lived experience or who have experienced housing instability. And a lot of the times, especially in the line of work that I do, there's usually no incentive for them to do so, simply because a lot of times we're doing the good work, and doing the good work is not enough, because at the end of the day, that just provides you with the ability to speak authoritatively about an experience you've never had, which therefore lowers your credibility. But a lot of times in a lot of these spaces, how you say we're seeing a lot of the same people, a lot of these same people are a lot of times have gone through the same experience. So they believe their credibility is the ability to speak authoritatively about an experience they've never had. So I think that is it. You got to go to the individuals that are actually going through these experiences. You have to provide them opportunities to be in these spaces, AKA give them jobs with salaries and benefits just like you have, and have an understanding that a lot of times even job requirements, they do not reinforce the ability for people with lived experience to be able to use that experience to trump a college degree, to trump 3 or 4 years experience to doing a job. So I think the role of a lot of policymakers and decision makers is to, first of all, think about the individuals that are filling these positions. And second of all, think about the qualifications. Third of all, how are you interacting with the individuals that are you're actually essentially benefiting off of? Taneeka, you muted. You muted yourself again.
I think Kelly. Yeah, Katie. I'm sorry, guys. It's trying to get me to be quiet. Katie and Lisa, did you guys have like anything, like another point that you want to highlight that Edward didn't already say?
I'll just add real quick, I couldn't agree more with what Edward said. And I think that that's a really great point to hire people with lived experience. One of the things that, because one good way to answer your question is there are coalitions like Renters United Maryland that Lisa and I both work with, and you do too, Taneeka, that do a lot of advocacy. And I think that it's important to include people with lived experience in a way other than just asking for them to volunteer their time, because that's what ends up happening. Can you take a day of your time and come down with us and talk? Well, that's difficult. And so I think that it's an excellent point. Coalitions like that are great. Like what Lisa said, that's how things get done. Everything is so interconnected, education, housing, medical, it all. So everyone needs to be at the table, but with that awareness also that to do the best to keep it on an even keel as to who's getting paid to do this work and who's doing it on their off time.
Thank you. Good points. And I know I should have said it's a mess that we are a part of, Renters United Maryland. And from what I'm like, so organizations and tenant associations can join. So if folks on the call, if they're interested, I'm sure Kelly can probably drop their website in the chat. But yeah, they're really big here in Maryland, and it's over like 40 or 50 organizations and tenant associations that kind of lobby for renters' rights. Okay. So we'll just move into, I want to make sure we have enough time for Q&A. So the first audience question is, when talking about getting assistance for families, what about the families or individuals who don't have children? Assistance for falling behind on rent. As stated earlier, people can't afford $1,000 emergency. Working in Baltimore City, I noticed this happens more often than not. Is there anything in the works for these families and individuals as well?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And honestly, I think the advocacy really focused on this school program in this last legislative session because it appeared that that was where there was a likelihood that the legislature would act. There are certainly programs for individuals and families without children, and they're going to be more focused on the rapid rehousing programs and the emergency programs there. The funding is different and the eligibility requirements are different. But by focusing in this discussion today on this new program for families with children, that's not to say that there are not other programs that are out there that are available, but the reality is not as many and not as much. I think really the reason why there was movement for children with families is that the data show, I mean, it is horrible. I mean, there was literally a program, a webinar last year about it was titled "Why Babies Bear the Brunt of the Eviction Crisis." And the reason for that is that new data that came out late last year shows that those most likely to be evicted are babies, children 0 to 4 years old. The next likeliest group is 5 to 9 year olds, and then 10 to 14. And of course, there's a racial component as well. So and Black and brown families are more likely, overwhelmingly, to be evicted in comparison to white families. So I think that data is what the people in charge of the dollars really focus on. And in this instance, getting the funding for the community schools program, that data was really useful and relied upon, even though there is an extreme need for families without children and individuals. Absolutely. And I wish I had a better answer for what resources are available for those groups.
Yeah, and I would just piggyback real quickly to say, because I always just like to be honest, because I worked a lot on this too. For a lot of people who make the decisions for us, COVID is over. The pandemic is over, right? So for a lot of them, they did not see the need to even continue this program. So that was the first conversation. They were just like, the pandemic is over. Why do we need this, right? And I think a lot of that came, if you guys read the study, that Kelly dropped the link in the chat, which you will see, because we interviewed all the programs across the state. It was huge kind of situations going on with fraud on both ends with landlords and tenants, just reapplying land, so I don't want to just say it was tenants, it was landlords committing fraud as well. So the program, even though we have the data to show that it kept people housed, it did what it's supposed to do, believe it or not, it was not popular. For that reason. So the only way that we could even get something to pass, they really just gave us crumbs, was to connect this to Blueprint, like how you guys talking about, like how can we fully fund the Blueprint for education, but we're not giving them a house to stay, right? And we were able to get, some funding for that, but hopefully, fingers crossed, we're able to get more funding next session and be able to expand it to more families. Okay. So moving on to the second question, what efforts are being taken to consider the working poor? They are the new face of homelessness and cannot get access to funding and support because they are right on the cups of the income guidelines. And this is for anybody. Just feel free to jump in.
I don't want to keep going in, so I'm gonna leave it to Katie. You go ahead, Katie.
Oh, well, I'll just jump in. I mean, I agree. I think that's sort of like the individuals without families. That's a tough spot to, that's tough. And I will say most of the clients that we have jobs, right? And they are just like the person said, on the cusp of the income guidelines. And it's probably a similar analysis when the access to counsel and eviction was passed. There was a decision that had to be made as to what level of service would be provided and for whom it would be provided. And so it was decided that the income brackets for that. So I guess I'm answering without an answer. I don't know what's being done, although I will say that our nonprofit, and I would guess others too, are always looking for additional funding that's not restricted in the same way that the access to counsel and eviction funding is restricted. So we do have some that allows us to take, in some cases, people regardless of income, and in some cases, people that are 30% over the regular access to counsel and evictions income limits. So there's that, but on a statewide basis, I wish I had a better answer. Maybe Edward does.
For me, I would dare to say that my answer is there's very little to nothing being done about the working poor, because the working poor are working poor by design. And so a lot of times, especially so for me as a former educator, right? A lot of times, especially if students are going through housing instability and they're not in schools or they're not fully focused in schools, it affects their cognitive ability. It affects their ability to critically think. And so if your ability to critically think is affected, a lot of times when you're going through a lot of different situations that, especially if let's just say you get your first job, right? You're thinking about, how do I use this money so that I can get basic resources for me to survive? You're not really thinking, what are opportunities that I can look out for me to be able to elevate myself to get to that next level? And a lot of times, especially with a lot of nonprofit work is reactive. It's not proactive. And there's a lot of organizations out here that are getting a lot of money for reactive resources where they work with high school students and this, that, and the other and the fourth. But there's not a lot of organizations that are proactive, that provide information and that provide proactive resources for, let's just say, students or young adults. And so I think that's a conversation that we need to have, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of organizations that are on the ground doing the work right now that are led by individuals that do have lived experience, that do not speak the language to be able to get access to a lot of the money that a lot of other organizations who are providing reactive resources are getting. So we have to think about, how do we provide that information to organizations that may not receive that much funding, who have a lot of value in the community? Because I actually spoken to a young man who runs his own organization, and he said a lot of times it's difficult for me to get access to funding, because how do I create a data point on when a young person calls me and says, I don't have any power at home, or I'm living next to a bando, so therefore my living situation is affected and they need somewhere to go right now? How do I create that into a data point I can put on an application to get money for? Even though we know the importance of it, but that's not quantifiable. So it's just like, I think that is definitely a solution. We need to think more proactively instead of reactively. And then this also goes back to children being viewed as property. How do we help students understand that their voices have a place and that they have the ability to speak on their own situation rather than just being the property of their parent? And a lot of times when we speak about our rights, a lot of times young people have no rights unless their parents say they have rights. And if their parents don't say they have rights, they have no rights, which puts them in a position to where, especially if we're talking about the working poor, by the time they hit 18, a lot of times, a lot of the resources or a lot of the opportunities that they weren't able to get access to because their rights were affected, that's how we get to that point. So that was just my solution.
Yeah, thank you. And that's a brilliant solution. It makes sense. You know, that we need to be more proactive instead of reactive. You know, and I think in that work, I think, you know, we also need to, the people that's in charge of building homes and affordable homes, I know that's been a focus, is trying to make sure that we are trying to build new places where homes are 50% AMI. A lot of times what we're seeing is 80% and 60% AMI. And that's really not affordable, not even down in Baltimore City. So just keep that number kind of in mind. We need to, you know, I definitely agree that we need more to be done for people that's like right on the fence. This is probably our last question. moving into the chat is, I was wondering if anyone could touch on ideas or solutions related to the intersection of housing and school when there is a lack of reliable transportation to school. I'm thinking specifically about Baltimore City, where many high schools are magnet schools and there is no designated school bus system for all students. Anybody?
Well,
Katie, I think that Eddie and I are looking at Katie.
Oh, are you?
Thinking,
I
hope you
can-
know something.
I could talk for hours about this, but unfortunately, solutions, I don't know. Transportation, especially in Baltimore City, has been an issue for as long as I've been working in and around the system. I think, and I mean, as I mentioned before with McKinney-Vento, the federal law provides transportation for students who are unstably housed, right? Like Lisa mentioned, if you have to move or for whatever reason, a student has a right to get transportation at the expense of the school system back to their school of choice. Unfortunately, in Baltimore City, that doesn't work because their transportation system is the local bus system. So no matter, in theory, no matter where you are in the city, you can get to your school of choice. Anyone who's spent any time in Baltimore City knows that's a theoretical solution and not an actual solution for many people, depending on where you're trying to go. So I think one thing to think about in Baltimore City is the whole system of school choice at magnet schools. And that's a whole nother conversation, but whether there should be a few schools that people want to go to, or whether every school in the city system should be sufficient and equitable and good for the students who live in that neighborhood so that students aren't traveling across the city. Another solution would be school buses, which I think that's above my pay grade. I've never heard that as a viable solution in Baltimore City. So I can say that there's been a lot of talk and discussion about that over the years, and no great solution. But I think one thing is to think very critically about the school's choice system in the city and how that works and whether there's a better way to do it. That'll be my chance.
That's a good point, Katie, because to your point, if all the schools are great, right, there would be no need for kids to be bused to the other side of town, right? Because all the schools be equally as good. And just, I know we're cutting really close on time, but let's just get this one question in. Because I want to be sure I answer everybody's question. So most of our policies are put in place by elected officials. Do you think it would be beneficial to educate the public on officials that are in place or trying to get elected so that their interests are being taken more seriously? In addition, how do we get the public to start to function in a proactive way instead of a reactive way?
I mean, I guess I'm gonna jump in. So for me, I would definitely say, yes, it would definitely be helpful because the difference between the have and the have-nots is information. And a lot of times, especially if we're talking about, elected officials, if we go for me, for example, I'm gonna speak for myself. A lot of times when I go to vote, I don't do research on a lot of the people that are on that list, either because I have a person that I already have in mind, or a lot of times I just didn't do the research. And for the average working individual, they usually don't have the time to put into, because they have one, let's just say if it's a working parent in a school, right? I mean, working parent at a school, they have 1, 2 children, they're working 2 jobs so that they can pay bills. They don't usually have the time to look up elected officials. So if there was some type of, let's just say option for, let's just say the Pro Bono Resource Center to do like an event at like a library somewhere close within the community that's giving information about elected officials coming up on a voting year, that would be something that I feel like a lot of people would be open to. They do canvassing around the neighborhood, let everyone know about, this is what's up and coming. This is how it affects you. We're going to be hosting this event here. And this is where I was saying even earlier, where about individuals with lived experience who are from these communities having these jobs, because a lot of times they would already know who to go to. They would already know where people gather. So all of these things are connected. But yes, that could be a wonderful way to get people to understand how these individuals affect them.
I think that's a great answer. And because bringing people in and getting them to have an interest, I think once you bring people into the discussion, they have an interest, but getting them there to start is where the challenge is. And that's where involving people with lived experience is important, because they know what's going to work and they know where it's going to work. And I think that's a really great point, and that was a really great answer, Patty.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. We're just like 2 minutes over time, but I want to respect everyone's time, and I want to thank, our wonderful panelists. Thank you for the work that you do in the community. It's kind of like you guys are like the silent heroes, right? Like we see things being done, even though it may not be perfect and more can be done, but things are definitely happening behind the scenes. So thank you. And again, thank you for everyone for joining on our call today. Remember, this webinar is recorded. So if you registered, you will get the recording to your email. And, maybe not today, but within a couple of days, it'll be placed on our YouTube channel as well. All right. Again, my name is Taneeka Richardson. I'm with the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. If you guys have any questions after the webinar, feel free to look me up on the website and send me an email and reach out. And if you're working with youth, get in contact with Edward. Reach out to him. He's available and he's ready to come and be of assistance. I can show you.
Thank
All
you.
right, everybody. Thank you. You guys take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.